I can just say hi to everyone as you're logging in, joining us, and we'll give it a minute to let the rest of the people come on. And Shauna, just let me know.
But we might as well get started and people can join Miami style.
Okay, so hi everybody, I'm Cheryl Jacobs, Executive Vice President of AIA Miami and the Miami Center for Architecture and Design. And we have a great exhibit that's up now that'll be closing at the end of this month called Time, Space, and Existence. And we were privileged to have two really terrific artists and architects who were part of the exhibition. Actually, I should say three, because we had a team of two and then another that are on the panel. And we wanted to have some programming around this idea. And we're really happy to partner with the University of Miami on this program. And by the way, please come by MCAD to see the exhibit before it closes on the 30th of this month. The cool thing is that we were able to do a 3D scan of the exhibition, and we'll be able to post it on our YouTube channel and on our website if you aren't able to come downtown to the center. So I'm happy to turn the program over in just a minute to our moderator, Christopher Meyer. Chris is a principal at Atelier May, and it's a design practice that is interested in confronting the realities of the built environment. The work at the firm strives to be conscious and generative. Architectural explorations are informed by cultural and environmental narratives and driven by a collaborative design process. Ambitiously, the design process endeavors to balance an intellectual pursuit of architecture with the practicality of building assemblies, tectonics, and making. In conjunction with the work at Atelier May, he is an assistant professor at the University of Miami School of Architecture and director of the Literal Urbanism Lab, LU_lab. The lab operates as a knowledge gathering center and project-based design group focused on the evolving dialogue binding architecture, urbanism, and the environment. And with that, and Chris will introduce our fantastic panelists. And let me also tell you, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A section that you'll see most likely at the bottom of your screen. I'll turn it over to Chris. Thanks.
Thank you. First, I want to thank the AA Miami chapter for hosting this and all the people behind the scenes, Cheryl and Colleen. You guys did a wonderful job bringing a lot of this together. And you offer an interesting platform for Miami-Dade County-based architects to really have some place to go and discuss things. So thank you for that. Additionally, I'd like to thank the folks at the European Cultural Center for bringing the Time, Space, Existence exhibition to Miami. And I would also like to thank the University of Miami School of Architecture and Dean Okuri for his support in these endeavors as well. So as we move into the evening discussion, I'd like to welcome our guests that are joining us through remote modality today, but also thank our panelists for agreeing to join us for this conversation regarding the agency and design. So tonight, we have four very active people. I think active is probably a very kind of weak term to describe how they're actually prepared to talk about tonight's discussion and what their work has been doing. And they're working within the context of architecture, academics, and most importantly, within their communities to foster a more just, affordable, and healthy environment. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panel. However, I highly encourage all of you guys to go investigate the things that are happening behind our guests. I'm unable to really offer a comprehensive picture of their work in this brief introduction. But our panel is composed of a diverse cross-section of educators, practitioners, and researchers working on projects inclusive of writing, art, architecture, and building. All of these elements that we've just defined here, writing, art, architecture, and building, acknowledge the importance of time, territory, and being through different ideological and methodological approaches. So to start our panel introduction, I want to first introduce Margie G. Northard from Glavik Studios, which was founded in 1999, which has made impact on communities through resilient and social conscious architecture, art, and urban design. As founding principal, president, and director of design, her studio has produced a diverse portfolio of projects from affordable housing, large-scale projects, parks, commercial spaces, to museums, urban interventions, and public art commissions. Our contemplative, broad-based work has explored complex social, cultural, and environmental conditions within Florida's unique landscapes. She believes the architecture is for the public at large as much as the end user, and should function at a high level and transcend prescriptive programming through maximizing design opportunities within complex constraints. Margie has been recognized both nationally and internationally in publications such as Arbitrary, Arc Record, Archinect, Metropolis, Bronetition. So clearly the work is out there for you to find. Please go find it. Shauna Meyer is a principal at Atelier May. Full disclosure, we are principals in the same practice, so I will be harder on her than anybody else tonight, where her work acknowledges and kind of an obligation to confront the blasé attitude towards architectural decision-making, which is responsible for shaping the natural and built environments. She feels this overarching trajectory of her career is to pursue attunement of architecture through the lens of energetics, environment, and material. In particular, this idea of craft and assembly. Through her practice role as a principal of Atelier May, an academic role as lecturer and researcher at the University of Miami School of Architecture within the Lou Lab, she's exploring design through the act of questioning without perceived bias, which I think is important to note for this evening's discussion. With her partner, admittedly, which is essentially me in this instance. Her work is rooted in innovation and design excellence with recognition of local, national, and global awards. She's also one of the authors of pamphlet Architecture 36 Point Clarity, which is a very fun a little publication if you haven't had a chance to look at it. Jermaine Barnes is an assistant professor and director of the Community Housing Identity Lab, or CHILL for short, at the University of Miami. I feel fortunate to share faculty with him, in particular as he's making a meteoric rise towards work in the community. So got to congratulate him on all of his recent successes, and we want to support him as best we can. He is also a director of Studio Barnes, which is a research and design practice that investigates the connection between architecture and identity. So mining architectural, social, and political agency, he's examining the built environment's influences on Black domesticity. His design and research contributions have been published and exhibited in several international institutions. Most notably, he's had work at the Museum of Modern Art, the Graham Foundation, the New York Times, Architect Magazine, Design Miami, Art Basel, and the Swiss Institute, along with many, many others, in particular the National Museum of African American History, where he's identified as one of the future designers on the rise. Please go check out what Jermaine's got going. Shaheen Rabari, assistant professor, environmental design at the University of Colorado Boulder. In kind of, I guess, in some respects, he's a colleague, a close working partner with Jermaine, and they've been doing some work together, which is important for you to go check out, in particular for Mass Context, the recent publication that they edited. So in his research, Shaheen studies ways designers organize to address social problems. He bridges sociological studies of social movements and race with an architectural theory. Shaheen is the founding member of Dissent by Design Collective, which uses design and theory building to investigate how dissent and counter-hegemonic tactics play out in urban landscapes. His work contributes to theories on contentious politics and the spatial professions, and employs ethnographic methods. This is a lot to try to take in from our panelists tonight, but I highly, highly encourage you again to go back and revisit their work kind of on your own time. It's an amazing group here. Okay, so to get into tonight's discussion, which I'm been lucky enough to ask to be moderated. I want to kind of introduce a bit of the premise before I start to poke and prod around with these individuals. So tonight's panel discussion, Agency and Design, fuses notions of vigilance, control, social, political, and environmental concerns through a conversation on spatial vernaculars and architectural typology's role in their past, future manifestations. Specific to our conversation this evening, the idea of spatial vernacular is a local expression of built forms that collectively define the physical condition of our environment. The domestic space or domesticity can be seen as a sinew connecting our evening's guests. However, from this connectivity, we will hopefully within this conversation get the opportunity to venture out into their individual explorations and architectural pursuits. They are all very diverse in their own ways, but they do have a kind of sinew that's connecting them, which we're very excited to start to explore. I'll do my best to kind of move our panel around through a conversation of an open and critical dialogue, reaching across time, terrain, and race to interrogate the potentials of architectural education and practice. So as we listen to this kind of introduction, this prompt, I want to encourage the audience to post questions in the Q&A, and I will try to moderate them and bring them up towards the end of our discussion. This should be a kind of a dialogue that includes our outside guests joining, so please make sure to take advantage of that, as Cheryl has already pointed out. Okay, so I want to move into our first question, which I have kind of defined here loosely as slow to change. So the kind of emphasis behind this is that architecture is notorious for being very slow moving and hard changing discipline. I believe it's fair to describe our contemporary society as fast and quick evolving. We've seen this happen quite a bit. I'm going to use a kind of a quick anecdote here to kind of lay this out. So to permit and construct a single family resident project in Miami-Dade County, it can often take as much as 1.5 years, which is an eternity when it comes to how fast things can actually move. Now that's an architectural solution for a single family residence, and other things can take longer. Yes, things can take shorter, but roughly that's what we're looking at in terms of a pace. When we look at maybe the medical practice, the mumps vaccine in 1967 only took 4 years, which I know sounds like a long time, but like we're looking at kind of medical breakthroughs from 1967. The COVID-19 vaccine took approximately 10 months, and the Zika virus took around 6.5 months. So when we're looking at this kind of capacity for other disciplines to respond to very problematic conditions that are happening in a contemporary condition, I think we're seeing that architecture has been slow to be able to progress any of that change or be a kind of an action of change. So current and civil, social, political, and environmental forces are requiring us to take swift action. That is moving faster than our discipline can actually respond, in my estimation as the moderator here, or at least that's how I'm going to start to convince them to talk about things that may be a little bit maybe tension-based. So how can we, in the field of architecture, move a bit faster to offer help to these pressing and urgent contemporary issues, such issues based in civil, social, political, and environmental concerns? So I'd like to first move to Shaheen to kind of push him into talking about this and ask him to kind of speak towards his understanding of active teaching as he's helping to shape the minds in the emergent youth that are going to be entering practice and interested in making change. So I'd like to kind of get him moving on that, and then we'll move into our other panelists. Shaheen.
Yeah, thank you. What a provocative set of questions. So time rate of change, yeah, and change in general. I guess one thing that occurs to me just from as you're talking about this is part of it's time and pace and sort of how slow our institutions are to respond to issues. But I think another part of it that I'll weave in is sort of our willingness to engage with these kinds of issues. And I think it gets to politics, and I think it gets to dealing with contentious issues. So people who study social movements, there are insights that they bring to kind of how do we collectively mobilize to address, really deep problems like the climate catastrophe, like racism. And I think part of the conversation that I see in those literatures is pace, but I think a bigger part of it is like apathy or unwillingness to engage, or people in places of power and positions of power not having the motivation or feeling fragile in addressing those kinds of things. So, in the architecture profession, like many professions, actually, a lot of professions are depoliticized, and that's sort of part of the history of the formation of professions in the US. And I can say a little bit about that if it's useful. But architecture is also a very depoliticized profession. We'll talk in the AIA and in other professional organizations and even academic institutions, we'll talk about things like gender equity, like anti-racism. But usually it's a pretty, I don't mean this in like a negative way, but in a critical way. Usually maybe it's a self-serving approach to these kinds of issues. So what can help us gain better membership? What can help us have a more, recruit more students into our program? So it's conversations usually at that level that don't undermine our institutions. It's always aimed at strengthening our institutions. And usually that's something that holds professions and the professional class in this country back from political engagement sort of at a deep, like destabilizing revolutionary level. So, and you'll see this, we were doing this study of political activism in the AIA, and there were activists who wanted to have more radical conversations around race, but they were kind of held at arm's length. But those who were having conversations that seemed acceptable, that didn't challenge sort of the institution in a radical way. So I think this question that you're asking about change and the pace of change, I think the time pace is a part of it, but I think a big part of it's also just our willingness to engage in political issues and to politicize things. Tied to it is a conversation on like reform versus revolutionary change in our institutions. And so I'll just say one more thing, and then I'll pause for others, and I can come back if there are questions on any of this stuff. But in the university, as a teacher, to answer that part of your question, I know many people have, and I've drawn inspiration from them, have tried or have worked on bringing sort of the politics of our issues into the classroom. And people are doing this in the studio and seminars and lectures. And I think it's pretty effective. Last semester, we had a large lecture course where we brought in this political mobilization kind of concept as a framework for the class, where it structured the course. First, students learn about what problems exist so that there are very significant existential issues in society and in the environment. The second thing they learn is that things can be done to address them. These are not things that are insurmountable. And then third, they learn how they can be a part of it. So it's a very politicized pedagogy, and I think that has an impact. So yeah. I'll pause there, but happy to come back.
Well, I think it's a fitting way to move into maybe getting Jermaine to respond, and I think it might be possibly a means to take off in terms of how the intersection of academic and practice has come to play as some of these kind of challenges in addressing civil or social or political issues are, I'm not for sure like the amount of interest you've been putting towards environmental causes right now, but clearly you're interested in the civil, social, political discourse. But I'm wondering if you can talk about, as you're seeing it kind of meld or come together or collide, maybe even collide with this relationship of academic and or academy and practice.
I think a lot of this stuff is all tied together, fortunately or unfortunately, right? I mean, like we're in a place in Miami where you can't talk about social and political issues without talking about ecology, without talking about environmentalism, right? That's why the Lou Lab and Chill get along so well, because they're things that are inexplicably linked. Climate gentrification is real. Understanding displacement of people because of natural resources is real. Understanding the way the city of Miami was built due to racial issues that are also tied to location and landscape are real. So it's like, it's impossible for me to do my work without having to come tap you all at the Lou Lab. It would be extremely irresponsible of me just assume that these things happen in a vacuum. So when talking about the work with students, we're talking about the work with other academics, we're talking about the work with other professionals, a lot of it is being able to contextualize the work and be able to try to help people to understand how all these forces collide and sort of the entanglements of the racial inequities and sort of the land grab that continues to happen in Miami, which are like massive hurdles that happen at a regular basis. So like a lot of times there's so many institutional hurdles that happened because, like, how can we teach students how to be architects, right? Capital A architects that may be licensed one day, which has its own set of guidelines and rules. But then also try to get them to understand that they're not building in a vacuum, they're building in an environment that affects people. And while you're affecting people, you're inexplicably going to affect a certain group of people way more than another group of people. And to be blatant, I mean, people of color are always going to get the short end of the stick. So there's always sort of like difficulties that I deal with as an assistant professor and as a coordinator of academic courses, because I'm trying to find ways to sort of embed reality into these projects, but also not embed too much reality that we sort of make the students jaded at 19 years old or 20 years old to where they don't actually desire to become architects. They're like, why should I do this shit if there's like nothing good that will come out of it? So it's like, it's a very delicate balance. But what I found is this new generation of architecture students are like way more brave than my generation, and like they demand what they want, and they have so much compassion for other people. They're able to say, I want to learn those difficult things because it'll make me a better architect. And so that makes me happy. But oftentimes it's difficult to convince my contemporaries or my coworkers or other people in the academy that we should alter these things, because by altering them, we're essentially saying the way that you all were taught was wrong. The way that I was taught was wrong. And if you tell somebody their foundational sort of rhetoric and practice is wrong, they're like naturally gonna fight back against that. They're naturally gonna be defensive. They're gonna say, well, why is it wrong? Or I was taught by this professor, or I went to this pristine university that like is infallible. But as we know that these things constantly get unraveled, and it's like, well, actually, that's not right. Or actually, there's a lot more that you could learn that you didn't learn. And so like, I find like these are the difficulties that we do on a regular basis. And like me and you have conversations about this all the time, sort of internally.
Yeah. I guess in full disclosure, there's probably a lot of interconnected dialogue that happened with most of the panelists here. So for those that are coming in from the outside, it's going to seem like there's a lot of inside discussion that's happening, but hopefully we can uncover it for you guys tonight on the screen. So Margie, I want to bring you in here and talk about your practice and how you're striving to work, with dealing with potential slowness and how buildings can impact communities. You're building structures that are supposed to be helping the public realm, that are supposed to be helping the kind of social causes of humanitarian efforts of maybe the less privileged, if you will, regardless of their backup or upbringing. And so I'm curious to know how you guys are dealing with the slowness in the practice realm to encourage change to happen at a pace that's much more useful when we need it now. Like, how do you do things when we can't get buildings now, but we need them now? How's the practice working out for you there?
Thanks, Chris. And thanks to everyone here on the panel today. It's great to just listen to what Shaheen and Jermaine have just said, because it is a political act, architecture, what we're doing, because we focus primarily on affordable housing, but without sort of questioning the methodologies of the power structure, the people who make decisions, the ordinances that are made, everything from zoning to, at the state level to the local level, we cannot move fast. We cannot do what we need to do. And when we focus in our situation on specifically trying to bring affordable housing to the average person, and a person also with a very low economic income, we have to change things. And so we have to have a certain amount of humility, I think, as well, to be able to recognize that these are things that need to happen, but we have to be steadfast. So we focus primarily at the moment on sort of designing models or case studies that can be utilized in other regions of the country, other markets. We try to understand these complexities and then try to act on them. And I'll give you some just basic examples. Housing insecurity, as we know, is everywhere. I mean, when we first started looking at this about 15 years ago, I couldn't have a conversation with it. It just wasn't easy to even talk to a politician or a client about really what we could bring to the table, because we recognized at that time the importance of it. So I'd say that the things have only got worse in terms of housing security. We have more people who need more affordable housing, and the two sort of largely the elements are largely responsible for the rise in homelessness, over the past 20, 25 years is a growing shortage of affordable rental housing, and of course the simultaneous increase in poverty. So for us, we spend a lot of time looking at the bigger issues that we're not specifically necessarily qualified to do, but we have to in order to understand them. And we also know that quality affordable housing does generate, economic development. It does bring in new taxes. It does create jobs. It provides security in communities. And so it addresses the inequality and the challenges that we have in our society. So a jarring fact, because I always try to remind myself what we're doing and why we focused on this. The children represent about 24% of the American population, but they comprise a staggering 34% of people in poverty. So just on the most basic level, I think society needs to take a look at itself and reconsider. And this is in the United States. This is not somewhere else, right? It's in our backyard. So we work with our clients and our partners on the financial side of it. We try to understand what the rent goal is. Say in South Florida, we're looking at providing a rental rate of $500 a month, which is low, right? It's a low number, and we also focus on the urban cores, because in the urban cores we have to look at not just housing but transportation as well. And when you think of, I know in Broward County, a combination of the cost burden of housing and transportation is up to 65% of someone's income. So it's really essential that we understand what the context is from a financial perspective, how the regulations and entitlements processes work. And then we sort of have to bring in other ways of thinking about this, how we design, what type of units, and we focus very often on just the cost of construction in order to bring that down. What do we need to do? And I'll talk later on how we're looking at innovative models for construction. We're looking at ways to speed up. How do you get rooms to be more available quickly? Because ultimately that's addressing the needs. And then the huge thing that people overlook sometimes, but many of you I'm sure have been a part of, is the whole Nimbyism, the sort of naysayers, the needing to educate the general public on why this is a part of their life and their problems and their future. And so these are some of the big issues we look at. I'm working with a foundation right now where political advocacy is just one huge part of what we have to do. They take out billboards, they call senators, they do whatever they need to do to raise issues, but in the long run, they also have to have policy changes in our regulations. So I think just as a beginning of conversation, I totally support what my colleagues have just referenced, and that's how we're dealing with it right now.
So Shauna, maybe you can respond or comment on this idea of spatial vernaculars and their role on the kind of civil, social, political, and environmental implications. This might have a cross connection with the work that you provided for the mass context vigilantism edition, and you may be able to talk through some of what that has to offer to this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for including me in this conversation, everybody. Fun to be here. Maybe to just rip off of what Jermaine was saying a little bit, that I think people, in Miami, it's very present because it has to be, because climate is integrated into culture so much. It's such a big part of it. And so whenever we shape space and make space, that's always present. But when we maybe think about practice and architecture in other parts of the country or the world, it's not always so present. And for me, and for the opportunity that we had to collaborate on the mass context writing, where we were thinking about the Mississippi River and the Delta territory, for me, I've always been fascinated in that vernacular. And then when we moved to Miami, I find it even that much more critical because, Jermaine, you talked about contextualizing space and work for students. And I think what's super important is to get students and people into these spaces and to understand how they act maybe as a precedent to Miami. So for those of you who have maybe been to New Orleans or been to the rural communities in the Mississippi River Delta and, you know, been adjacent to some of these levee walls that are 20 feet tall, you know, hundreds of miles long. And they are these very forceful, permanent, you know, boundaries. And they really divide space, they shape space, they disconnect space, and they confine space. And then you come back to Miami and I see us positioned, you know, a couple hundred years behind New Orleans, and people are talking about, you know, well, let's just raise the sea level wall, you know, it's, you know, a couple feet, you know, and so right now it may be even with the, you know, the water, but then it's a couple feet, then it's 4 feet, then it's 8 feet, then it's 20 feet. And I think it's critical that we understand if we start down this path, where we're going to end up. And so I think for us, you know, and then also the notion of, you know, tying that spatial vernacular to social and cultural, you know, the Delta has this so complex and fascinating history of the, you know, the formation of our country, you know, the culture of our country, and people may not realize that or think about it. And those spaces that are defined are tied, you know, from, you know, decisions that were made in the 1700s to current days. You know, now we're experiencing the residue. So to me, I know this isn't really answering your question, but when you talk about slowness, I thought about the fact that, you know, in the 1700s, let's say a decision was made, and today in 2022, people are experiencing those decisions as these, you know, confinements and these, you know, limiting boundaries of space. And so the slowness there is just amazing. And in one of the ideas that we talked about is from Ruha Benjamin. So we borrowed her idea of the glitch in our writing, where she uses the glitch as talking about when we perceive something as a glitch, it may be a malfunction in the system, but really it's exposing a systemic issue within the system, and the glitch helps expose that. And so we use the term the glitch as sort of the 1927 flood when the levee walls failed, right? And so, you know, Shaheen, earlier you were talking about, is it a revolution or sorry, I wrote it down, or a reform, right? And so sometimes, you know, you need a revolution, you need sort of this glitch, this catastrophe to cause change and eruption, and that's a quickness, but then it's, you know, our reaction to that. So is our reaction to just patch it and you know, see the lens of that action as a glitch, or as a discovery and an exposure to a situation that then needs to be, you know, responded to through sort of a revolutionary response. So.
Hey, Chris, can I respond to Shauna?
Yeah.
I think Shauna's keying into something that's like really, really important and really, really like focused. When she speaks of the glitch, and she speaks about like cataclysmic events that like forces a person's hand. When it comes to water, I can't think of, well, when it comes to sea level rise, let me be very specific. When it comes to sea level rise, I can't think of the cataclysmic event in South Florida that would then force a person's hand, right? Like we had Hurricane Andrew in '92, but that's like a combination of forces. But when I think about Katrina and I think about New Orleans, I think about the Delta and the way that you both write about water, like that's specific to just water rising, less about sort of the external force that happens with water. So perhaps part of the slowness and part of the sort of hesitation of adopting certain modalities, or the hesitation in adapting certain processes, is because like we haven't had our foot to the fire yet, right? It's like there hasn't been that seminal moment that says, yo, we don't have a choice, we have to make a change. Because the incremental things that we're doing are placating us at this moment. And having lived in Miami for like the last 9 years, I can't think of a single thing that has like made me think that, oh, we can't get past that, right? And so when you're in it and you're thinking about the fact that this is my reality, how do I project forward? It makes it difficult to think about resiliency. But then if we position ourselves academically, or we position ourselves professionally, like within our school of architecture, like resiliency is super important in the way that we teach. It's super important in the pedagogy. So it's like, how do we convince people that this thing is a problem if it hasn't shown itself as a problem that requires people to then believe it's a problem? And like that's always the issue.
Yeah. Maybe just jumping in on that on 2 seconds, you know, what you said earlier, Jermaine, about the students being more brave and demanding things. And I think what we can do maybe as academics, I mean, practitioners as well, but we get to engage more with future academics or future architects as an academic, I would argue anyways, is empower them to question, you know, within these categories or themes or situations. You know, I think we can broaden their horizon of what architecture can and should question. And so, you know, not coming to the table with answers or, you know, like doomsday scenarios, that's, you know, but just empower them to question. And I think you said it earlier, like, we are sort of evolving, hopefully, as a younger generation that demands more answers, and then we can move to that.
Chris, I got to jump in on this too. This is too juicy. I'm thinking about Don't Look Up. I hope everybody's seen it. But I think Jermaine and Shauna, what you bring up is, you know, I think there's a role that our institutions play in making visible what should be friggin' alarming as hell. So, and there are ways that we can hide that. So I think going back to what Jermaine said, like, there are ways we can be resilient about things and be like, okay, yeah, so what? We didn't get any snow this year in Colorado, who cares? But there are ways that we can be like pulling our hair out and running out into the streets kind of without our clothes and like, this is absolutely nuts. And I think it's not just a natural human behavior. I think a lot of it's mediated by the media, by our institutions and stuff like that. So Shauna, a counterpoint to what you're saying, I wonder about the strategy of creating alarm about, you know, as educators, as, you know, leaders of our state chapters of AIA and so on. Is there something to be said for that? To be like, okay, no, this is like, it's the end of the world right now. Actually, it was 10 years ago. So anyways, it got me thinking about it.
Well, there is a lot of the end of the world talk that we get occasionally, but I think actually what you guys are all kind of saying, and everybody within their responses in the first round was talking about the kind of context that lies just outside of what architecture as kind of capital A education or practice has, policy and civil cultural things, but all of those things in terms of their influence on how we operate once we leave the kind of educational realm now becomes super critical. And so I'm wondering if you guys can talk just for a second on the kind of contextualization of your work relative to the kind of outside players that are bringing the most amount of influence and maybe raising alarm or maybe bringing awareness or making change. So like, I don't know, maybe you guys can refer or reference some of the kind of contextual things that are non-architecture with a capital A that are helpful or useful or maybe influential in your guys' approach or processes. Anybody could have answered that.
We got you, Chief. I just wanted to see if Marjorie wanted to jump in because we were having a busy convo.
Sure, I can jump in. You know, I think I'm a little myopic in the way of my trying to solve for some very specific things, but in a way the issues are so global and so big that just what we're talking about right now, I would say I think language makes a difference. And I think, for example, in my world, we met where the regulatory environment measures value by income. You know, these and we use phrases like affordable housing. I struggle with it, although it's the easiest way to communicate what the topic is, but it's so imbued with issues, right? So I think that we have to really break down the type of language that we use, and then I also think that we have to be resilient ourselves in how we approach solutions. It's about repeating and repeating and repeating. I know that this sort of idea of things not being visible is one way of thinking about it, but you know, I work a lot in Los Angeles, and it's all visible now, right? The problems, you can't walk anywhere without seeing folks who don't have a place to live and who are now having to live in the public, realm. And so we can, and still they can't solve these problems. I'm sorry not to be too down on this, but I worry that even if it's flooding, people will just raise the buildings up. And I don't know that I think as humans, we suffer from our entire, our belief that everything will be fine. And in some ways we've got blinders on. So, and I believe that we need to, that's why I say humble, a little bit of humility, and then complete steadfastness, and also rallying the troops like we're doing in this conversation. So I'll defer to the others for the rest of that.
No, I think you're spot on. So I don't know if you remember, but you and I were on a talk at
We were,
like,
yes,
a while
I do
ago, right? And we were
remember.
talking about similar issues,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Of equity in architecture, capital A,
Yes.
but also like actual practice, right? And so
Correct.
I've always been a fan of your firm because you take on the difficult projects.
Yeah,
And like
thank
I've
you.
always wanted to take on the difficult projects also in the things I do outside of academia. And then at a certain point, right, you like have to make this moral decision of,
That's right.
do I want to keep fighting the good fight, which is clearly like emotionally taking attacks on me and like physically taking a toll on me.
Right.
Like this is
Right.
all I can talk about, like how to undo these unfortunate systems that call things affordable housing, what literally
Yes.
just means tax credits and the way that it's
Right.
funded,
Right.
versus luxury housing, which means it's completely private equity. But then I like have to explain that to my students, and they're like, "But professor, that doesn't make any sense. Like, why can't we just do the other thing?" I'm like, "You're so right. Like, I wish we could just do the other thing."
Right. Just do
But
some housing.
yeah, but it's so difficult
Yeah.
to do that, and I know it might seem defeatist, or it might seem pessimistic, but I think at a certain point, like I know as a professor, I get inspired by my students all the time. Like I think
Definitely.
the students we have at University of Miami, the assistants in the labs, like they're always pushing us to not settle. And they're
Yes.
always pushing us to say, you don't have the right to be jaded because I'm your student and I need to feel inspired. So when you go home, you can keep those thoughts to yourself. But while you're here on campus, I need you to show me that there's another way using the tools that we have.
I
Yeah.
think that's
I couldn't agree more. Go ahead, Shauna.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's a great point, and you bring up something like accountability, right? I think that is one of the things that maybe not only our profession, but the world is struggling with right now is accountability. And, I love to hear you talk about the students and the labs, or even if you have a practice, the people that work for you, you're accountable to those people. And I don't think, this is kind of getting back to the question that Chris asked about, who are those, or what are those other forces that sort of enable or empower you? And I think, this is also a common topic we've been talking about tonight, is that intersection of academic and practice, where there's like, at times academia brings a certain accountability for projective thinking. The sky's the limit, like you said, like problem solve, anything's possible, there's no constraints. And then practice is like, you have constraints, you have budgets, and you have, often clients or realities to respond to, but the meshing, and the conversation and the dialogue between those two realms is really what helps inspire, I think, me and us, if that's fair, Chris, in our work. And maybe something that shifts the topic just a little bit, when you talk about who are, sort of other supporters in your work. Like recently, we've been collaborating with like the US Forest Service and the Florida Forest Service, and that may sound super nerdy, like Donatello-y, but it's actually really invigorating to know that, whether there's industry, but, industry thinking about money or whatever, it does come from an ecological perspective, to think about how can the building industry and the design industry better engage ecology, to think about understanding materials and products, as an earlier resource other than, just when it's on a shelf and we specify it. So maybe I can come back to that a little bit later, but I just wanted to bring that up now. We lost your name.
If I can, China, I know you probably want to say something really bad. If you do, I can get, okay. So I'm going to try to move this forward just a slight bit here. And what I'd like to do is to kind of challenge you a bit on your own particular processes. And so Pablo Picasso has been credited with stating that every act of creation is first an act of destruction. And clearly architecture has to live with this kind of approach. But I'm interested in this kind of undertone of Picasso's perspective, pointing towards this kind of condition that in our pursuits that are aiming to create positivity and productivity and supportive outcomes for those that really need it, there's always a certain consequence. And I'm really kind of interested in hearing from the four of you in terms of these kind of conditions that you've encountered, in terms of consequences that you are almost bringing onto yourself. So maybe how have you dealt with them in terms of your creative initiatives, and maybe what are some of the methods you've used to kind of work around or at least maybe turn them into some kind of positive when it's all said and done. So Margie, I'd like to ask you to kind of go first on this, and we're going to move from practice, I think, towards academia. And so, clearly, as you are working on affordable housing questions, there is no doubt there is this kind of constant relationship between creation and destruction, whether it's policy, whether it's economics, in terms of the models, whether it's dealing with the kind of perception of cultural understandings and what people really need in terms of empathy. So I'm interested to learn from, I think, a bit about your practice dealing with the ideas of kind of creation and destruction and their kind of tie.
Destruction's a big word, isn't it? I think I would like to approach it on a slightly different tack, and it also follows from slowness. I think we have to be advocates, right? I'm on the positive side. I think advocacy versus destruction may be a way I can achieve the same intention here. We really believe that if we develop designs that are scalable, that are replicable, that inherently have a high quality of design and quality of life, and that reduce costs. We provide more access to the average person for quality housing. Now, how does that relate to your question? I think that this is a strategy that inherently is somewhat revolutionary. It sounds very practical, but inherently people are not doing this. We also know that by building anything, we're increasing, carbon emissions, and it's challenging. So we've tried to look at those metrics and then think of how a construction methodology can assist in getting us there. And so we've been looking at volumetric modular housing and volumetric modular construction processes. They're faster. They have less waste. They're more efficient. You can build quicker. But inherently, we have a stagnant construction industry that doesn't like to shift and change and respond in a nimble way. And so in our efforts to try to address this, we have to be very collaborative. Collaboration was mentioned earlier. We have to collaborate, and we have to wear a little bit of a tiny architect hat, not that huge one that we like to wear whenever we are in projects. And we have to be willing to subvert our overall design goals sometimes to a system, a manufacturing product, something that we employ as a device, and then we can utilize it in a way that allows us to leverage the big picture goals, right? The idea of moving fast, and also of changing, being a paradigm and a shift and a change agent, which is what is implied by the Picasso quote. So I would just say that recognizing the challenges and then working with the system in our case, and we're doing 2 big projects. We're doing a 15-story high-rise building in Los Angeles this way, and it's taken 5 years and 3 contractors so far to really try to get it to the cost per per unit that we have to get it to, and have a livable environment which communities are proud to be a part of. And we're doing another one that is 500 units and 27 stories. And so these are two projects. We're actually doing one in Miami, but it's not quite there yet. These are ways we've been exploring how to develop systems that in a way are inherently disruptive. If we can pull these off at the price point and the quality, we think that they will be ways to others to follow on. So that's a kind of positive way of looking at negativity, I guess.
So maybe we shift towards Shauna and understand how your work on fostering the maybe sustainable or renewable, renewably grown regional material sourcing, processing, manufacturing that you're trying to implement to service regional building needs is addressing this kind of mandate for cultural shift, which is not necessarily ready to accept these maybe changing construction ecologies. So maybe you can speak to how the work that you've been pursuing is dealing with this kind of long-standing cultural kind of root, if you will, and how this might be needing to kind of be a bit of destruction in terms of its movement forward towards new construction.
Yeah, I can. I think it's fitting that we are representing sort of Miami and LA as a couple places to practice this evening, because within the US, you know, I haven't practiced in LA, but I understand that those are sort of the two most difficult municipalities to practice within. You know, the codes and the process is so laden and overly burdened that just, you know, realizing something within an existing process is a struggle, you know, a success, but then trying to innovate within that process, to innovate within policy, to push for change is a really difficult process. And again, I have been thinking about two things, listening to Mari respond and your question, Chris. So one, like the actionable consequence, I think what's critical, it doesn't have to be from an academic side, but, you know, educating our clients and our developers as well. And so I'll use like Kielmo's book, Unless, is an example where, you know, he wrote a book about what it took to build the Seagram's building in Chicago. Oh, sorry, my mind's going blank. And, you know, questioning every aspect of that sort of architectural icon, right? That jewel that, you know, maybe returning to the notion that Jermaine said earlier, when we are taught something's great and then maybe later on we learn more of the story, or it makes us question, you know, yeah, it could be great for those reasons that we were taught about, but maybe there's more to learn about it and we need to sort of evaluate something from a holistic lens. And so I think putting that out there, that's sort of what Kiel's doing, is putting that out there and charging our profession to question the decision-making, what goes into a building, the materials, where are those materials sourced from, and who are the lives that are actually, you know, getting those materials, and what type of life do they have, and what kind of influence does an iconic jewel piece in Chicago have on a remote village, you know, halfway around the world. And so I think that sort of global agenda, you know, when I sit up here, I feel very preachy right now, and I probably lose the attention of, you know, any practitioner, you know, some practitioners or developers. So how do we shorten that story, but bring it to the table when we're in practice and we're trying to make policy change? And so the other thing I'll add is, in my personal experience here in Miami, you know, we talked about a little bit, you know, some of the work we're doing is trying to, you know, build with mass timber in southern Florida. And as Jermaine mentioned earlier, you know, one of the, you know, sort of big shifts that happened in this urbanism was in 1992 with Hurricane Andrew. And if someone, you know, wanted an exciting Saturday night, they could look at the codes and the history in you know, since maybe the 70s to present, and understand how that shift from, you know, a lot of the stick or wooden frame structures, like, you know, tons were destroyed from Hurricane Andrew. So then that set into motion this notion that we can't build, you know, framed wood, and we can't build with wood. And so it's written into several of our codes. now that you can't have wooden structures in different municipalities within the county, and those are stagnant codes, while the construction industry is dynamic, and whether it's, we can discuss its slowness, but there is technical evolutions happening. There's, digital fabrication, different types of fabrications that allow us to build differently now, but these codes aren't ready or don't know how to accept these building methodologies. And and something else we are definitely experiencing is it's rooted more in just the policy makers. It's rooted in the culture of the people. Wood is bad for many reasons. You see it, in this time period. But if you start to look at the history of Florida before the 70s and maybe go back to the early 1900s, you see that actually wood is embedded in the cultural language. So it's kind of fascinating in terms of trying to think through how do we bring and expose those moments of culture that actually understand a material of place or an embedded knowledge and bring that forward. Because one thing that we've lost, I would argue, is our understanding of material of place when we build. And with this global market and global economy, we can build with anything. And so how do we bring some of that knowledge forward and sort of implement it in a contemporary fashion with contemporary techniques and ecological solutions?
Yeah, I just want to also maybe clarify, you're not saying wood is bad. You're just saying they said that, right? Sorry, I think I was obligated to say that. Okay, so Jermaine, maybe he's got it. It's Wednesday night, guys. So Jermaine's been teaching studios at the University of Miami that I think have been over the past couple of years really starting to challenge. And I think also Shaheen will be able to jump into this next set of questions, but you've been teaching studios that are challenging this kind of civil discourse or political discourse, or how we actually understand these very long-standing, rooted, systematic issues with our understanding of people in place. So possibly you can address this kind of question of breaking down or destroying something just to kind of build maybe as more of an active approach for productivity or positivity. And so maybe Shaheen, you'll probably jump into the end of this, but I'll definitely phrase a question for you, but feel free if you have something in there that's exciting to tag on to Jermaine, please do so. I'm actually thinking about your dark mode studio only because we shared space at the time and I watched that kind of grow. And so maybe there's another studio that means more to you than that one, but possibly that's a kind of jumping off point of getting us into academia in terms of breaking down systematic issues.
Yeah, the dark mode studio was a lot of fun. Part of that was because we had a lot of new technology, like we were playing with the headsets. Which were a lot of fun. And my studio was right next to yours. And so we had all these students who never used Magic Leap before. And so just find an excuse to use really cool technology. But I think that the biggest thing about the way that I personally teach studio, and specifically upper level studios, which are typically option studios for those who are not sure how sort of the academic process works. You have the core studios that teach you foundational tools to become an architect. And then in your last year or two, you have the option of taking whatever interests you. So you become more laser focused on the thing. And maybe that's affordable housing, maybe it's landscape, maybe it's building systems. In my case, it was always narrative. It was less about sort of altering the canon, less about sort of dismantling the old masters. It was always just about what are you interested in as a student? And how can I facilitate you having 15 weeks of what you're interested in? Because oftentimes the students are beholden to what we as faculty are interested in. So if I'm interested in high rises for the semester, the students are going to do high rises. If I'm interested in monuments, the students are going to do monuments. If I'm interested in hotels, the students are going to do hotels, right? And so whenever I would do my upper level studios, I'd always say, you're going to come up with your own projects, right? These mini theses that the students would do. And what made dark mode so fun is that you got to see the personality of the students and you got to see what they were passionate about. And so it's always fun as faculty to see the things that make your students excited. It's always fun to see what they're passionate about. It's always fun to see what will keep them sort of generating new work for 15 weeks, because that's always like a hurdle as a professor. How can I keep you engaged for 15 weeks and you're not being paid? So like in that process, like that's what I always found like most enlightening, because then I learned from them because they have completely different experiences than I have. So dark mode, which was like my way of talking about public space, the students took that and ran with it. And they talked about it from perspective of like of family, of friends, of gender, of sexuality, whereas ways I never thought about architecture. Like I could think about one project from a previous student. Her name was Sydney Maubert. She's currently at Yale. And when she was doing the project, she was super interested in her Haitian background, but specifically, what does it mean to be a Haitian woman in Miami and your access to female healthcare? And as a man who's heterosexual, cisgender, I don't think about these things on the regular, and that's my own failings, right? Like I think about, I can go to a bathroom anywhere, that's easy. But in learning through her, I was able to understand the plight that a lot of women of color deal with when it comes to reproductive rights, when it comes to access to just typical things like tampons and a bathroom. And I learned this because they were allowed to forward themselves in the work. And I was like, holy hell, like this is extremely like enlightening work. Like I never thought about this stuff. Or another student which talked about micro housing because she donated a lot of her time at children's shelters, and how many of the young people who live at children's shelters, they get one little bag and like those are their belongings. So she was trying to figure out ways to design something that's portable that allows those students to take home with them everywhere they go, because home isn't like the place, home is like where you find. And so for me, pedagogically, even though I was trained a certain way, I try to give the students the platform to voice their own opinions, because I learn way more from them than they learn from me. And like those types of studios give me the platform to do that. And I think it takes a lot for an architect to do those things, because we're always taught like our way is the right way, and that these 19-year-olds don't know anything, or these 23-year-olds don't know anything yet. But in listening to them, we learned so much, because I had no idea about these issues because I'm a man, and like the patriarchy does what the patriarchy does. Like I forward myself in a lot of these conversations. Like I don't have to worry about these things. If I need to, I can go outside and use the bathroom by a tree. Like it's easy. Like that's what it is, right? But it's like if you're a woman, like there's so many things you have to think about that I don't have to think about. Or if you're a child who's born to 2 orphan parents, these are things that I don't know about. Like I was born to a 2-parent household. So I think the good thing we have as faculty, and the good thing we have as professors, is that we can learn from these young people who are like so invigorated, like so passionate about the work, and have so much to tell us, that then we just have to listen. And a lot of times we don't want to listen.
Yeah, I think it's a great point to bring up, that this kind of really revolving and continually growing student body in terms of their knowledge and what they bring to the university keeps us very lively on our toes, and it's very important. And I think maybe Shaheen, you could probably address this through the work you've been doing at Colorado Boulder, and telling us what you're learning in terms of maybe this kind of relationship between what Picasso has laid out for us here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what Jermaine said, 100 billion%. We had a studio similar in nature last year, Descent, where students took on their own project and their own expressions, and that was more focused on political engagement, so their own expression of politics. And what that ended up, what we started seeing with people talking, and they came up with their own phrases to describe it, but like politics of refusal, politics of boycott, politics of like dismantling things. And I think that's useful in response to this. And I'm thinking about, I'm just jotting notes here, but maybe like at 4 levels, and I'll just say it really quickly. I think this kind of breaking down and this destruction is very productive. I almost wonder if it's just absolutely necessary. Like we have to do it. It's imperative. If we don't, we're kind of like going with the status quo, and the status quo is like going back to that earlier conversation, very alarming. So I think, Jermaine kind of also mentioned briefly like canons, breaking down the canons, dismantling those canons. I think that is, so like, who do we study in architecture, history, theory, and those kinds of things? I think absolutely, yes, super important. I think there are systems too that we engage as architects, systems, regulations, norms of practice. So design of solitary confinement, that's something that's codified that we kind of have guides and best practices to do, but it's a violation of international human rights. And finally, the AIA has made some progress on that this past year after like decades of really hardcore action and organizing by some really dedicated people. So I think that's, there's so much juice there of things that we need to dismantle. A conversation that we had in the class was the border wall, and there was an installation that an architecture organization firm did with the seesaws, Rael Sanfratello, and I think very productive and very rich in many ways, but there was a lot of criticism about it that I think is also important to pay attention to, that you're engaging with the thing that needs to be dismantled. So there's no way of reconciling it, of making this an infrastructure of maybe, some kind of coming together at the border, that cute kind of gaming is a settler colonial kind of privilege to do. And then there was an article about this in the Funambulist magazine, and what those authors were saying was like, we need to be designing kind of bulldozer strategies to tear this thing down, not playing with it. And then finally, the last example I'll give, I think, of a very productive kind of destruction and dismantling goes to the Moss Context project and the graphic design. So I see Igor's on the call, the editor of Moss Context, and Bobby Joe Smith III, who was a graphic designer, came up with a brilliant strategy of symbolically, but effectively dismantling sort of like the control of the text on the page and it as a structure. And, it was metaphorically, it was sort of like this white structure, and then you had black figures occupying and disrupting that space. So even at that level, I think, that was a very, I think it was playful, but a rich example of one way that we can use our design, visualization, graphic sort of techniques to play with dismantling.
I think it's fascinating to hear all of you guys talk about, in some ways, the kind of productivity of what deconstruction or destruction can offer. I think what the question in some ways was attempting to kind of get at is this relationship of your guys' process in active kind of dismantling of things and destruction of them to build back better. And so I think you all address that in some fashion. So I'd like to kind of move then the discussion to this idea of representative architecture. And so, from the standpoint of what you guys are all doing, your responsibility within the practice is maybe a little bit different than what it used to be. So within kind of the idea of guiding the development of our built environment, we've in some ways kind of been removed from the actual process of the construction of our spaces, and we're just guiding the construction of spaces. And that essentially sets up a very kind of interesting relationship with architecture and representation. And I'm not for sure if we're making any progress within the recent years on architecture and representation past the kind of post-digital stuff that was out there. But I'm interested in hearing from you guys relative to your work, how you use representation as a means to uncover or explore the kind of uncharted territories that you guys are all working to kind of get into or to chart, if you will. And this is both a means of communicating your ideas to audiences, but I think maybe more importantly, it means to kind of find the project itself. So how are you kind of individual processes leveraging this kind of representational support as a means of conveyance of your architectural positions? And so we could, I think, maybe start with Jermaine and maybe look at your work. I think I'm going to try to point to some work because I'm interested in hearing about it. Hopefully the guests at least have some knowledge on it regarding your front porch conditions. And so if you could maybe let us understand maybe this relationship of representative architecture in the front porch project, that'd be great. Maybe there's something else that's better, but you can lead us there.
I think the porch work is important, and so many people don't know this. So this is gonna be the first time I reveal this like to the actual public. So I was applying for architecture grants, and I was always trying to be in tune with like what was in vogue at the time. but those weren't things that actually spoke to me as a designer. They weren't things that spoke to me as an architect. But I was just like, all right, the world cares about parametric design. I'll put forth the proposal that talks about parametricism. The world cares about this. I'll do that as well. And I kept losing. I never won a single one of these grants. And then finally in like 2016, I said, I just need to talk about what I'm interested in. I need to talk about like what makes me happy. And so like what makes me happy is my culture. It's my identity. It's the absence of my identity in architecture. And so the porch work literally was just born out of, I wonder if the Graham Foundation will give me money to talk about my friends and family. That is literally where it came from. My family's from the South. Great Migration is huge in the story of many Black Americans. My grandmother and grandfather would tell me tons of stories about sharecropping in Arkansas. And like for many people don't know, sharecropping is basically slavery, right? It's like the legal version of slavery. And like these are my grandparents, and like they're telling me all these stories. And I'm like, yo, this shit is so fascinating. And it's all spatial. But I was worried that nobody would care because in academia, like we don't talk about this stuff. So like I put forth that work out into the world because like it was passion to me and to my family and to my grandparents. And like that's honestly where it came from. So like a lot of the stuff that I do is like literally rooted in the identity of a group of people that help build this country that are often like ignored. And fortunately that work has like rocketed me to like the forefront of architecture at the moment. But like, it's not because like I'm special. It's just because like I've had the opportunity to like tell a story that's like missing from our canon. So a lot of times when I talk about my work and I talk about things I'm interested in, it's literally based off my family. Like, and they bring me so much joy and inspiration that I have no problem being excited about it or talking about it or like showing that stuff. And I think the porch, while it's a very ubiquitous space, like people understand porches, but it's like, do you understand how important porches are to Black people who were born in this country and only had very few places that they can sit and enjoy and feel safe, or even not feel safe. And so like using architecture to tell stories, or using architecture as a griot, which is like a West African term of narrative and storytelling and the keeper of stories. I like to use architecture in these playful ways. So like going back to dark mode, like that's where the inspiration came from. It's like, what is the narrative? What is the story behind these spaces? How can you imbue yourself into the work? Because I find when the students or when the academics or when practice like centers identity, you get really cool shit out of it. Like you get really amazing stuff out of it. And then the powers that be, the developers, the people with the money, like they can't center themselves because now something else has like grabbed the reins and taken focus. And so like, I'm trying to find the professional versions of those. Like I have some in Opalaka, but it's like, now how do I continue to build on that and take it out of like the theoretical academics standing, then bring it into practice and bring it into the things that we do on a daily basis.
So then that would lead us, in a certain vein, towards Shaheen's work with frames, with kind of an exhibit you guys worked on. And I hate to say that I'm not as familiar with it as I think I am with the front porch work, but I think it does have an ability to address this idea of representation architecture and how it is actually used as a tool for addressing some of these very important civil, social, cultural issues that we're currently kind of facing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just not until now, as Jermaine was speaking, did I realize the kind of a connection between, I think, this idea that you brought up, Jermaine, about identity as being this really generative and like kind of like the gold mine of architecture creativity. I think the frames exhibit is something different, but now I'm really eager to think about it in the way that Jermaine was talking about it. But it was almost holding up a mirror to each of us, ourselves, and looking at our complicity. So, maybe Jermaine, if yours is kind of rooted in Blackness and in kind of your family history, this is kind of looking at me as kind of like, representative of a racist culture and of supremacist culture. So a lot of it was about looking at and representing oneself, and in a predominantly white institution and a community like I'm in Boulder in Colorado. I think it made me aware of kind of what I am in a different way and how I'm complicit in these conversations. So that exhibit, the frames exhibit, the frame is referring to, it's a sociological concept, and it's how we like sort of like make sense of the world around us. And there are these theories around colorblind racist frames, ways we make sense of the difference between races, especially in this country. And so one might say, no, I'm not a racist, but because Black people don't work as hard is why there are not that many of them in school. It's a simple cultural thing. Like there are these explanations, ways of explaining away racist policies, racist behaviors, racist ideologies that we carry. And so those were the frames. And the way the exhibit was sort of designed spatially was to bring people to these kind of like frames in which they're looking at these social situations. Anyways, I see this as kind of a connected conversation with how Jermaine is talking about identity, whereas here it's positionality. What is it about ourselves that we bring, and how can we represent that as architects to kind of call ourselves out on our complicity in like, you know, extremely devastating social problems like racism in this country. Yeah.
I think this idea of positionality might be a great segue for Shauna. Your work that is dealing with environmental implications, albeit seemingly not necessarily human driven, is actually the undertone of that is very much based on the kind of human implications that we have within our resource dependent extraction societies, and the kind of offload of those environmental pressures on our rural environments, which might often be maybe impoverished where the kind of extraction is coming from. So I'm interested to see how your work is dealing with this kind of relationship of representation to kind of uncover some of these deep-seated and kind of systemic issues.
Yeah, I think providing a little bit of background, you know, for me, what architecture has always been about is understanding a place and all the characteristics that that place has. And maybe it's a sort of search and discovery process because I don't have a specific, you know, heritage or experience or history to point to. I grew up living a lot of different places and sort of being exposed to different scenarios. That what really drew me to architecture was that it is all interrelated to language, and that, you know, language is a result of culture of place. Culture of place is a result of the physical, environmental, and ecological factors that surround a group of people, and that, you know, these factors form customs, and then customs form culture, and culture and customs form sort of our built environment. And so I think for me, I've always been in search of, you know, that embedded knowledge of place, and the things that I find fascinating, like if I'll reference like the tobacco barns of the Connecticut Valley, you know, I don't know, Chris, you'll have to correct me because I can't remember the quote, but like, you know, need is what you do when, you know, when you can't afford to get it wrong. And so like the tobacco barns of the Connecticut Valley are so in tune with, you know, the trees that grow, the bents and the size and the scale of these barns are based directly on the tree's ability to grow, on the, you know, quantity of tobacco that's going to need to be harvested and dried. There's just these very simple materials and methods that were deployed over time by the people that lived there and that understood, you know, the materials that a place had to offer. And I know I said this earlier, but I do think that there's so much value. You know, I know that, you know, I'm not like a Luddite. I'm not against, you know, technology and building differently and evolving the way that we build, but I think it's super critical that we always point to what a place has to offer in terms of material and resource, and how can we as a people, you know, reflect on those materials and our environment around us and sort of, you know, build in a way that understands and engages those, and also reveals maybe the customs, you know, of the people, of the language of the place.
So as you were talking about building and materiality and kind of extracting that from the kind of region of culture, I'm interested now as we move towards Margie and seeing the work maybe that belonged to the Renaissance Center and how that might be something that's extracting local social, you know, equity or like a social conditions to kind of bring together an architecture that might find root in a place. But you're not in control of the building, clearly, but you are in control of getting this idea both uncovered and conveyed. And I'm interested in maybe how that process kind of came about as you try to, work through some very difficult architectural solutions and proposals.
Thank you, Chris. I'm from South Africa, just let's put it out there. And so I came from growing up in a country where racism was, that was the legal mandate of the way I grew up. And so equity issues have always been deep down in my soul. I think I'd have to address them through architecture. I don't know if it's because of my background or just how I would have been anyway, but this is something that it drives a lot of my thinking and how to address them, whether it's gender equity or racial equity or just equity in civils and how we treat each other. So that background, also the great thing about South Africa is we do have an incredible diverse population, but we also have an incredible landscape and environment. And for me, growing up in South Africa, that was truly an opportunity to appreciate the sort of hierarchy of the human versus the animal. And I wasn't always sure that the human was always the one that was dominant. We spent our lives walking in the wilds and spending 7, 8, 10 hours, in areas that were virtually uninhabitable. And I developed a very deep appreciation for my position in the human feeding cycle. Then if there was a lion or an elephant or a rhino somewhere, it definitely was not going to be that they would come out on top, right? So that's a sort of a slightly funny way of saying it, but I've been very, very keen on understanding environmental experience, sustainability on levels that aren't just about how we relate to architecture. For me, I made a connection early in my life in doing architecture that everyone has the right to space. That everyone has the right to a great environment, landscape, the sky. And I wanted to imbue all my work with that sensibility. And at that time, it wasn't necessarily about affordable housing or unaffordable housing. That's a passion for me. So in working in these difficult environments, like in urban cores where the needs are the highest, we have to really try to think how what we're showing, what we develop ultimately is a great experience, a great place to live, but also represents something that tells others that this is a desirable environment. This is a great place to be. This is communicating success, not hardship. And it also is addressing the needs of the local community. So in the Renaissance project, which on our website is still called Madison Adjacent, it just changed a few weeks ago, that is in Skid Row. And so it's in the downtown. It's a very challenged area. Pretty much every sidewalk has people living on it. And there, I've been visiting that area for many years now, and I will see the same people. So it's not that, these are communities that are now evolving and living in these areas. And so the challenge is displacement and also getting into housing and having and dealing with all of that. So our architecture, we really believe, affordable housing is a human right. And so the choices that I make to try to work with a system that allows building faster and is more sustainable, to me is just, it's really just fundamental. That needs to happen. We have to find solutions that we can bring to the table that are really fast. High-rise construction has problems. It's inherently not sustainable because it's using a lot of materials. So there's conflicts in that, and we wrestle with that. We know we are, for example, in order to wrestle with something like that, we first looked at modular companies all over the world, in Poland and in Malaysia, and we realized that we needed to work with companies in our backyard. So looking at local vendors, taking the time to understand their systems, and then seeing how we could employ them to develop an architecture that speaks to the experience. We in this particular project, we don't have balconies. in my other projects, I've put balconies, and balconies was a thing in Florida for me. I felt like every single person deserved a balcony. And that was kind of like my front, not equivalent to the frame or the front porch, but in a way, I felt that if I could design a project where everyone got to be inside and outside and enjoy the quality of life that is afforded in Florida, then I was contributing in some way to that through my architectural elements. So yes, I think those are the main things I'm focused on in terms of this discussion, and we can talk about others later.
Well, actually, we're getting close to time. I think we're about out. I would like to ask as we close here for your guys' kind of final thoughts on what this kind of agency and design discussion is meant to kind of, I think, inspire. Clearly, the conversation, I think, was set up in a way that wasn't going to be the most, I think, comfortable. We're talking about discussions that are hard to have in a way that is, I think, not going to be frontal or brutal, but I think that they're very important. And so maybe as we close here, I would like to ask all of you guys in closing thoughts on what you kind of see for kind of future of your work, and maybe what you think in the kind of next steps for architecture might need to take, both in practice or in academia, or you guys can come up with something completely different. Jermaine, you can start.
Oh, no, I'm going to jump in. I'll just start. I'll give everybody a moment. No, I wanted to thank you guys. I've enjoyed being part of this conversation. And I think for me, the value is the different aspects, to hear how everybody sort of engages the discipline differently. And one thing that we all share is, I think, that we all engage it from different angles, and that we're trying to constantly understand, and question, like, what can architecture be, that there aren't limits or bounds on it, but how can we push that? How can we push our voice? And how can we empower others to share their voice? So I've enjoyed the opportunity to share my voice this evening. I'll leave it there.
I'll just go ahead and take the baton from Shauna and say, I like the idea of questioning things. I like when students question things. I like when we as practitioners question things. Just because something was done one way for a very long time doesn't mean it was the right way. It just means that's how it was done for a very long time, until someone provided an alternative. So why can't we continue to provide alternatives? And I hope the people that have stayed on with us this whole time find the courage to present alternatives. And thanks, Chris.
Go ahead, Sean.
I'll just say quickly, I think, the diversity of the panel in terms of where we're at with our work, conversations like deep in academia and research, and then teaching, and then practice, and sort of like very prolific practice. I can see in a lot of ways it being kind of confusing, like, how do these things relate to each other? And I'm thinking about my wife, who's an engineer, and I sit in on their meetings and panels and conversations, and it's not as diverse in terms of like ways we can tackle prompts like these. And so I really appreciate that. And I think it's really exciting to be part of a field that has these very different things. And I think these different approaches and different ways of practicing the field. And I think even if it's our connections are not always legible, forcing ourselves to be adjacent to each other in these conversations is very important. I have like notes that I took during this call. There's so many things that just came from what you all were saying that I think in the realm of just like research and scholarship and theory is incredibly productive that I would not have had otherwise. So I guess it's a long way of saying thank you, Chris and everybody, for hosting this. Okay, Margie.
Well, I think everything that's been said is great. I just want to say, to the students and younger, emerging professionals, for me, conviction and passion about what we're pursuing and how and sticking to it. I often get asked, how come you're not sort of worn out by this process? And I just think that it's so, when you have a belief system in that you can make a difference, and you don't have to be doing high-rise buildings. I mean, you can be doing an exhibition design. It doesn't have to be this type of architecture. But I think for me, that is what's what is, when a project that you've worked on for 5 years gets turned down and you get in the front page of the newspaper because people are yelling that you should go home Florida and things like, go home foreigner, sorry, things like that, is you can't brush it off, but you can take it and you can use it. And I think leverage is another important term. So I just want to thank all of my colleagues on the panel, and also Cheryl and those at Miami. Just thank you for this opportunity, and hopefully the conversation will continue in different ways.
Yeah, so in closing, as people are trying to get to probably dinner or happy hour or drinks, I want to say thank you to the panelists. I think it's I don't want to call it bravery, but I do think that every time we kind of come out in public and we say these things, we are taking some chance. And I think in that chance, we have the opportunity to make change. Just like what I think most people are calling for here is to go out and make change and to try to take something and provide an alternative, provide some kind of backbone or position that will help us build a more just and sustainable society to kind of exist within. So I want to encourage that as well. I think that there's some, Sean Goodsell in a lecture that was given at the ARC League had mentioned that he was essentially blasted for a project that he did, even though he's such a humble and very kind of straightforward guy. And in doing so, he said that the work then was validated as being important because it turned people into some kind of critic or challenge, so that they had to actually evaluate where they are within the kind of position of the architecture or whatever the kind of work you're doing, writing, art, academics, it doesn't matter. But it's in that kind of framing of a project in a way that is challenging the kind of status quo that we might find you might get a lot of resistance, but we have to smile in the face of that resistance, embrace that resistance, and then go in there to kind of help understand how to implement that in a way that's beneficial for all those involved. In the closing, I want to say thank you to AA Miami for allowing us to host this event. I want to say thank you to the ECC for bringing this time-space existence to Miami and kind of getting us involved in some exhibition work to talk about the city in a way that's maybe productive but critical. And I want to thank University of Miami School of Architecture and Dean O'Coury for, again, supporting a lot of the initiatives that we have going, in particular, those that are University of Miami faculty, Jermaine, Sean, and myself. So with that, go look at their work to the panelists, go explore what they're doing. There's a lot of good stuff here. And I want to wish you all a happy afternoon and evening. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all so much. And, our tagline for MCAT is a place for change. So we love having these kinds of discussions, and thank you again to the panelists. Chris, great job as a moderator. Take care, everybody.
Enjoy all.